Daniel, so I would like to today talk about make Belarus the topic of our discussion for starters. And I would like to hear about your assessment of Vladimir Putin's statement about the possibility of placing tactical nuclear arms in Belarus. What do you make of it, and what consequences should we expect?
Well, I expect that this is part of President Putin's attempt to continue to rattle the West, to try to put them off their guard a little bit as he tries to escalate in response to what he sees as a deteriorating situation on the battlefield. I think the reality in terms of the military threat of that is not that significant in the consequences of the resources on the nuclear side that Russia already has, right? And so moving them an extra, 500 kilometers closer to Poland does bring tactical nuclear weapons into the field for the Baltics and Poland, but it's not really something I think that is meant to change the security calculus significantly for Europe, given that they already have plenty of ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons in their arsenal. I think this is more of an effort to show bluster. It's probably also to speak to his domestic audience, to show the strength of Russia in response to what he sees as continuing Western support for Ukraine and the threat, as he describes it, to his people of NATO encroachment.
Putin said that the construction of the facilities would be completed by July, although he didn't specify the date of the transfer of the weapons. Does it, to you, sound like a premeditated step or indeed a reaction, as he pointed out, inspired by the latest developments, including the transfer of depleted uranium munitions to Ukraine from Britain? Because this was brought up by the Russian side as a pretext for this step in Belarus.
Yeah, I would expect that it's a little of both. I would be surprised if they hadn't already been making plans internally for this as a way to offset what they see as the threat of the United States in Europe towards Russia, and that this was a way to position themselves in countering that threat on a strategic level. So I would expect they'd have already been talking about it, but I expect the announcement was a result of the recent UK announcement to give weapons that include depleted uranium, which really have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. That's not what they are. They're just armor-piercing depleted uranium. Has less radioactivity than natural uranium in the soil.
Daniel, speaking about Belarus and Lukashenko, of who you have special expertise on because you worked as the U.S. ambassador in Belarus, how do you assess his standing in the conflict with Ukraine right now, and what do you expect the most likely course that Minsk will be taking in the next few months?
Well, I think President Lukashenko is in a very difficult spot, right? I believe that he wants to protect Belarus's independence. I believe that he would like to keep Belarus at least technically out of the war, or Belarus territory as being involved in the context of a war party. At the same time, of course, he's had to provide material support to the Russians. He's had to provide through fare for Russian troops into Ukraine for the initial attacks on Ukraine, and he's been also providing some personnel support to the fighting. Now, as you see, in moving potentially more weapons positioned into Russia, probably that's the beginning of what will be those permanent deployments. It's going to make it more and more difficult for him to maintain his sovereignty and independence in a real way, even if it's nominal.
Daniel, Ukrainian troops, we know, are fortifying the border with Belarus as we speak. Is there a real expectation that Belarus will enter the war? Because you were in Ukraine, you heard the discussions and you saw the situation there. What do people think?
Yeah, I mean, I think they take it seriously in the sense in Ukraine, they are preparing for that as a possibility. But on the probability side, it's lower in the probabilities because opening up a new front, while it stretches Ukrainian troops, it also stretches Russian defenses. And in particular, that's a very long border between Belarus and Ukraine in the north. And while Ukraine has been very careful not to strike Russian territory with its weapons, well, there are some cases that you may see in the news. They don't oftentimes claim credit for that because Western allies have been pretty strict in saying weapons shouldn't be used for any attacks on Russian soil. If Belarus were to enter the war, I think that calculus would change, right? Belarus isn't the same as Russia, and if Belarus became a party to the war, it could actually start losing some of its territory, right? And then it would have to be in a defensive position. So my expectation is the strategic calculation at this point is not to open another front with Belarus, that Russia would be disinclined to do that. But I think they like threatening because the threatening then requires Kiev, in particular, given the proximity to the border, the major city there, to make sure it keeps a fair amount of defenses in the north, and that makes it easier for Russia to continue its advances in the east.
Daniel, when it comes to Lukashenko's stand-in, just recently, we saw him visiting Beijing, and it was a state-level visit, and he was welcomed and greeted in the Chinese capital. And there were promises of indestructible friendship from Xi Jinping there. What do you make of these dynamics of Lukashenko reaching out to Xi, actually visiting Beijing? Is he looking for new partners, new support? Is he just serving as another additional diplomatic channel for the Russian president? How do you read these dynamics?
What my expectation would be is that it's less about another channel for President Putin, because Putin doesn't need that, but instead there are probably two elements to this. First, on the strategic side, President Lukashenko is trying to shore up his independence, right? And so the idea that he can have an independent relationship with this major power in the world will help give him some confidence that perhaps he can protect the sovereignty and independence of Belarus from a Russian attempt to try to create a greater Russia with Belarus. Second, economic attention is probably the second issue there, which is the economy of Belarus is suffering greatly as a result of the war and the sanctions. And so anything he can do to bring additional economic support to Belarus would be very welcome. And I'm sure that was probably also high on his agenda.
It's interesting, Daniel. The European Union representatives said that they would respond with additional sanctions imposed on Minsk should Russian tactical weapons appear in Belarus. Do you think at this point Lukashenko actually cares about the amount of sanctions, because he's been sanctioned so many times? And can he afford not to kind of ignore these warnings altogether?
I think he cares. I mean, these things are not something that he wants to see put in place. It affects his country, his economy, his populace. But at the same time, he doesn't really have a choice, right? It's not like he can choose to go against President Putin. The alliance there is really determined by the pace that Russia wants to set for it. Lukashenko can dance some, he can delay, he can try to do some feints here and there, but at the end of the day, he is going to have to succumb to Moscow's will on this, given the current situation, right? He does not have the security support inside his country to be able to defend against something like Ukraine is defending against, and he probably has no illusion that if Russia wanted to, they would not think twice about militarily taking over Belarus.
But probably it's not something in the cards for President Putin, is it? How do you see, even from your times back in Belarus, did you feel that this is something that could potentially ever happen geopolitically, Russia being forcefully kind of imposing itself on Belarus?
Yeah, and I don't think they'll have to, right? I mean, so no, I don't think there'll be tanks rolling across. Of course, we never expected that in Ukraine, right? So I guess the reason we don't expect it now is not because it hasn't already happened in a neighboring country, but because it's probably unnecessary in Belarus, right? the Belarusian options are so much more limited than Ukraine's, right? We got into this situation with Ukraine in part because Ukrainian aspirations for a European and EU future, and that kind of pushed us into this current dynamic. Belarus has never come even close to that dynamic, right? They don't really have the strong political, economic, or trade ties with the rest of Europe. Their dependence is so significant on Russia that Russia just needs to squeeze much harder on the economic levers, oil and gas, and then the political levers, and then the security levers. I'm sure there's a lot of already strong coverts and other types of security engagements inside Belarus, right? That Russia is very good at manufacturing results that sometimes they try to keep their fingerprints off of. All the rest of the world it's obvious to the rest of the world who's involved in. So I'm sure the leadership in Belarus is conscious of the power that Russia holds there, and it wouldn't require tanks if at some point in time they wanted to forcefully, in a political way, create a permanent union between the two countries.
Daniel, if we turn to the situation in Ukraine, you've been there multiple times in this year. I wanted to ask for your assessment. We didn't have a chance to speak right on the anniversary, but then it's just, it's symbolism. It's a year, it was a year, and now it's a year and 1 month of the war going on. And it sounds like on the humanitarian side, you feel that the supply structure for the civilian population is not working as well as the military supply. Correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe just tell us a little bit about what you're seeing right now there. Is it something that you expected to be seen several months back? Is it better? Is it worse? What are you most worried about?
Well, I think the good news is, they are making it through the winter, and that's positive. The resilience of the Ukrainians and kind of continuing to be able to survive following the infrastructure strikes is still amazing. But at the same time, what's happened is, especially near the front lines, right, the lost infrastructure there is the worst, and you're not able to get that back up and running. So you're really relying on that voluntary and international and Ukrainian kind of humanitarian assistance in those places. And what we're seeing there again is it's the people who can't get out that are in the most difficult situations. So elderly, chronically ill, and disabled, and others who have no place to go, people without relatives and friends. So there's still a lot of people stuck in these very difficult places. The second thing I think people probably forget is over time, this has a cumulative impact, right? People that living in Kiev and the other parts of Ukraine had savings when the war started, and they used up all those savings. But now those savings are gone after a year. And what happens when the economy keeps getting hit like this, when there is electricity goes off, the stores shut down, schools shut down, hospitals have to go on generators, and many of them don't even have that anymore. What happens is the economy, the employment starts suffering. People don't have their jobs in a reliable way. Payroll isn't happening like you expected. And so what you can't see is this slow fracturing underneath of the structure of the economy. West is trying to help. G7 has promised $39 billion in economic support this year, but you still need that infrastructure to hold it all together and to sustain it. This is what Putin's counting on, right? Just this slow degradation of the economic situation and the living situation. What he underestimates is the resilience of the Ukrainian and the stubbornness, in a positive way, of the Ukrainian people not to succumb to his will on this. And so I don't think they're going to give up, but I would expect the situation each year this continues to get much more dire and serious for especially the vulnerable parts of the population.
From what you're seeing, Daniel, is there a big difference of how people are being challenged with all this in maybe in the capital region and closer to the front line? And we're seeing people older people being evacuated, some people refusing to evacuate. What have you noticed there yourself?
Well, I do notice that, right? Because the city still runs in Kiev with lots of energy and activity. When there is electricity, the shops and the coffee places are open, the stores are functioning and stuff. Where you see it not coming back to life is the places where the battles had happened, right? And so I did meet some people, and where these places where their apartment buildings were completely destroyed, towns were in very difficult situation. There wasn't much happening there. The stores had all closed up, and they weren't going to open again, regardless of electricity, because of the damage to the infrastructure. Those Ukrainians are saying, "What about us?" Right? We were protecting Kiev, and yet, where's the support? Where's the help? Where's somebody helping me get my apartment back, or my business reopened? It's because of all the challenges, the government doesn't have those capacities right now to do it. But it does create a frustration with those who have suffered the most, feeling like, when are they going to come now and help us rebuild our apartments for those places that have been liberated or have protected the front lines, the rest of the country?
Daniel, from your huge reconstruction experience in Iraq, for that matter, can we say that until the war ends, meaningful reconstruction effort is not possible? In other words, is it a requirement for the military actions to start for those apartment buildings to be rebuilt, for these people to start getting meaningful support, etc.?
No, I mean, the challenge is its bandwidth of leadership and the management skills and the resources that it takes to do that, right? Where you put your resources. Reconstruction takes a lot of money. And if you're focused on just maintaining the economic situation at the current state, it's hard to find new investment money to do that. But in fact, it would be wise, right? Because it provides jobs for people and puts people back to work and shows the population that you are starting to rebuild in some of these areas. And it gives that spirit, adds to that spirit of the Ukrainian people that we will come out of this and we are going to survive and we're going to actually thrive in the future. So I would recommend that. I'm sure they're already doing some of this. I just didn't get to see it, where they're doing some also reconstruction and rebuilding. I think right now they're just focusing on the infrastructure, which gets attacked. But anything they can do to start actually showing how they're going to focus on helping people rebuild their lives will also be valuable. We worked a little bit with some of the independent trade unions there and others to try to talk about training programs and things like that, because you're going to need a very strong, skilled set of workers to do this at the level that they're talking about. Government can already be talking about that. I know they already have plans in place in the government and the planning ministries and others as to how they're going to think about this in the future. And I think it'd be wise for Western countries to already start supporting them and visioning a day after the war, right? I think it's a really important visioning thing. So it's a great question.